Welcome to our Appalachian Mid-Year Energy Summit webinar, and thanks for joining us. This is the last webinar in conjunction with the Appalachian Mid-Year Energy Summit webinar series. But just as a reminder, all attendees today are muted. We'll have a Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please utilize the Q&A function that is at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar if you have any questions for our presenter. This webinar, along with all of our webinars, are recorded. Recordings are available via a link from our website at sustain.appstate.edu. Today, we have presenting Jay Lanier. Jay works as an account executive with Interface, the world's largest modular flooring manufacturer and a globally recognized pioneer in the field of industrial sustainability. After recently achieving their Mission Zero goal in 2020, Interface has set their next goal of climate takeback, where the company will be fully carbon sequestering by the year 2040. Jay is motivated by the prospect of realigning business and industry to solve instead of create the world's greatest challenges. He is passionate about continuing the legacy of his grandfather, Ray Anderson, founder of Interface, who championed the business logic of sustainability and finding creative solutions to address climate change. Jay serves on the boards of the National Wildlife Federation, the Ray C. Anderson Foundation, Muddy Sneakers, and Eco-Foresters. Originally from Atlanta, Jay now lives in Asheville, North Carolina with his wife, Whitney, and son, August. He is a graduate of Wake Forest University. So Jay, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Absolutely, Lee. Thank you for taking the time as well. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll jump right in here. So big thank you to all of y'all for the opportunity to tell our story, talk a bit about what we see as the next big trend in the building industry around sustainability and what we've really kind of come to know as embodied carbon. So I'm going to go to the previous slide and start there, where, at the beginning, like you might, and we'll jump in. So once again, this is really about kind of addressing what we have seen as one of the emerging trends in the industry right now, in the built environment. And for right now, I think we're going to start this conversation by really focusing on kind of setting out the problem. Strangely, as many of you might kind of have felt the change in the United States or wherever you might be sitting right now, that, when I began giving a version of this conversation a couple years ago, there was a lot more need to spend time on kind of talking about what's really going on with climate change right now. And I think you can pretty clearly see from I imagine many of your anecdotal interactions with other folks that the question of if has changed tremendously. There may still be holdouts talking about the why and how things are changing. But where I think that has really, really changed in terms of the conversation around climate change is it has moved to a personal place. It's one thing to be talking about parts per million, and I certainly would be remiss if I didn't bring in a graph that talked about that here in just a moment as well. But where this has really changed is that the conversation around climate has moved away from statistics and has started meeting people where they live. And I think that that's what we're kind of seeing when we consider, the effects of climate change in the forest fires we're seeing out west, because there's extra fuel load from pine beetle not being killed off, and it's claiming many trees out there that just add to the severity of those kinds of situations. The droughts that in many ways help to spur the conflict in Syria, exacerbating poverty and concentrating people in cities and growing very restless over their circumstances in those situations once again. And I think it's really becoming pretty apparent from the level of tropical weather that we're encountering even here in the Southeast, that more than 50% of the recorded Category 5 hurricanes have happened in the last 30 years. And that starts to give us a little bit more of it, then I think even regular folks are starting to recognize that something is different, something has changed. For a little bit of context, I think this graph is fairly illustrative of where our situation is as we begin this conversation, kind of laying out the problem that needs to be addressed. And going back 800,000 years, certainly there's plenty more of the history of our Earth to consider here. But what's worth noting is that the human species, Homo sapiens, really shows up on the scene somewhere here in between 200 and 250,000 years ago. And what this graph, in thinking about it, shows me and strikes me as really somewhat profound is that the conditions that allowed our species to evolve no longer exist. We've moved past the Earth, the state in which our climate and our surroundings have that allowed for our species to even exist in the first place. We are truly in uncharted waters with regards to the climate and its resiliency. So certainly something to take a moment with to think about there. As we think about kind of the different paths that climate change can take us down, or we can choose to take, I think is probably the more active way to think about this. This is a graph that kind of charts out some of the courses that the IPCC would say, you know, okay, this is something that we can think about. Obviously, the top version of this graph here is kind of an unfettered growth where we're relying exclusively on population dynamics to slow climate change, kind of a business as usual approach that would honestly lead to a level of catastrophic results that I don't know that any of us are really prepared to consider. In between there and the incremental elements, we've got our 3% or 3-degree increase that, you know, that may be likely, but certainly well beyond the 2-degree guidance that we've been given as kind of a, if you want to avoid the very worst of this, it means staying below 2 degrees. And what you're kind of seeing here with a projected peak of 2040 to 2050, you know, there's a chance that if this graph continues, we can reach our goals by, you know, the end of this century, perhaps. But where the real opportunity lies potentially is within the idea of trying to peak emissions as soon as possible, and essentially driving them to zero within the next 50 years. I don't think that's impossible. I mean, we changed the climate unintentionally. I'd love to believe that as a species, we can change it back if we're intentional about it as well. But where this really factors into my industry as a global manufacturer of commercial flooring products was really sobering when you consider the operational and the embodied nature of the CO2 emissions related to making buildings and running buildings. It accounts for 39% of global emissions. This is the largest chunk of any other related to the supply chain for creating, building, and maintaining and providing the energy for our structures. So in reality, if you were to start in a place to truly look at the biggest opportunities, the lowest hanging fruit for addressing climate change, the building industry is certainly still ripe for opportunity there. And you kind of want to take a moment to ask the why of this. As we're here meeting through Zoom as a result of the global pandemic, it's really interesting to look at this slide from a group that we've been listening to probably pretty closely in the CDC over the course of the last 12, 13 months. But this is their slide that they've released about the human impacts of climate change, as opposed to anything that we would typically associate with climate change being something for the wonk set, the folks calculating emissions and factoring all that in together. But in reality, as I mentioned earlier, I believe climate change is getting more of its day in court, its attention within the public sphere, because it's truly starting to affect more and more people. I think when you consider the ecology and disease vector that allowed bats to come in closer contact as moving further north in certain parts of eastern China, there's a case to be made that the reason we're having this meeting through Zoom is actually related to climate change. When you consider many of the other aspects that we've discussed already about conflict, there's certainly human health impact going on there beyond the things that we typically associate, like extreme heat, severe weather, and the direct results of many of our most polluting industries for the air pollution element that's there. So this is the slide that I think grabs most folks and says climate change affects people you know, not just the world at large in a strange kind of distanced, mentally over there kind of way. So as we address the elements within the building industry, I think it's important to break this down. Many of you probably have a great concept and understanding of this already, but it's important to remember that operational carbon is the, for folks who use this parlance, that's your scope 1, your scope 2, the direct use of energy that a structure, a building, a car, or a hairdryer, you name it, anything that plugs in, that's the amount of carbon related to its use of energy. That's operational. But the embodied carbon is the carbon emitted while making, assembling, building that building, assembling that car at a factory, or the crafting of, maybe your phone or something along those lines. An amount of energy was used. Some of that energy likely used a carbon burning source to create it. So therefore, those items have energy associated with climate change built into them. And that's our concept with embodied carbon. So for a very long time, honestly, with the beginning of LEED, as many of you all would be familiar, so much of it was focused on tracking emissions from building operations. And there's a good reason for that. It was the way we could measure change. It was the place that we could go directly to users and owners of those structures and say, here's how we can do right for your wallet as well as for the environment by using less energy. And while that is absolutely a valid way for us to make sure that we're considering and continue to consider the efficiency of it, what is just now really starting to come to light is the iceberg analogy here, the specified emissions, the indirect influenced by what you're purchasing and the emissions associated with making those materials. As we go back to it and we're starting to think about these materials and embodied carbon as a solution to avoiding the worst effects of climate change, it highlights the path that we're kind of seeing here about peaking our emissions somewhere around now. Obviously, we're past 2020. But if we're able to do it, we have a very good chance of avoiding the very worst influences and impacts of climate change as we're kind of seeing here. But what that really implies is essentially reaching a zero emissions target by 2050. Now, there's an old saying that essentially says shoot for the moon and land amongst the stars, even if you don't make it. But at the same time, this really kind of gets at the idea of the pursuit of a zero emissions target by 2050 does ensure the best opportunity for our species, not to put too fine a point on it. So with 2050 as our target for zero emissions, and whether that's within the building industry or simply the aspects that we can control, it really presents a window of opportunity. And it's important to think about with the building projections from the Paris Climate Accords and what we were starting to anticipate with the levels of growth that we can anticipate over the course of the next 29 years now, is that we essentially are going to be building 2 trillion square feet of new and renovated structures. And that's a lot. That goes into the category of too much to really wrap our heads around. But this particular comparison helped to bring it home for me. 2 trillion square feet represents essentially building New York, all 5 boroughs, once a month for the next, in this case, 29 years. And that is a lot of materials. That is a lot of concrete. That is a lot of steel. That is a lot of glass. It's a lot of carpet tile and other finishes you might find inside those spaces as well. So let's ask the question, what is the carbon footprint of that much stuff that we can anticipate being built between here and 2050? And taking a global average of it as we think about it, you've essentially got your embodied carbon footprint. That's released in the very short period of time to make that concrete, that steel, all the core and shell elements, all of the elements that go into building a building. But from the operational standpoint, it starts at day zero and then starts proceeding from there. So you have one big burst of energy in your embodied carbon on the front end that you can never really get back. With operational carbon, there's always going to be an opportunity to further retrofit and improve efficiencies. So when you're thinking about it, there is a case to be made for really focusing your efforts on embodied carbon, because once it's spent, if you're thinking about this from a carbon budget, you can't get it back. It's built in to the equation. And when you total those up between 2020 and 2050, you're actually almost even in terms of where those two things break down in terms of your impact. It's been very easy to measure this up until now, much more so. We're going to be introducing the tools that will help you measure what we can do to influence the embodied carbon footprint of your buildings as well. Now, it's important to remember this is a global average. That's taking into account the developing world, perhaps the less stringent efficiency standards that they might be putting in place to make sure that they can achieve the growth and development targets that they need. But what happens when we're thinking about a Western, more developed country that has more opportunity for better code, better materials science, and making sure that our buildings and structures are more efficient? Well, if we're using just as a rough cutout, the idea of 50% better operational practices, we are seeing immediately right then and there that the embodied carbon practice, if you're not measuring it, stays the same, bringing the operational carbon footprint down to 34% of the total emissions of that building, from the building and the use phases between here and our kind of hard cutoff of 2050. So that gets us to a place where all of a sudden this embodied carbon piece becomes more and more important the better we get at operational carbon efficiencies. Now, if you take a moment to think as well about master planning and the structures that are perhaps on the docket for another 15 years from now, it's not as though that we're moving the period that we have to have the right amount of impact on moving things towards zero past 2050. That's still a hard cutoff date. So the import of making sure that this happens sooner than later only gets compressed as we realize that building the same building today as we would 15 years from now makes the importance of that embodied carbon footprint within that consideration that much more important, moving it to 79%. So the further we go every day, and you can even say every second that goes by as we move closer to 2050, makes embodied carbon all the more important. And as we think about the kind of calculus equation that goes from all of the things that would be built today up until the building that's built on the 364th day of 2049, when you actually start totaling where the energy consumption for making those structures and operating those structures, it actually starts looking closer to 90% is going to be tied up in the building materials, the factories that make the concrete and the steel and the glazing and all of the other elements. Basically, did you melt a rock to make this kind of stuff that is so important to making buildings that last for a long time and are more considerate of their overall lifespan and usage? That's where it's going. So that kind of brings us to the framing of the problem part of this conversation. Essentially, we're staring at about 29 years to avoid the worst elements of climate change. We need to be essentially getting to zero net carbon emissions. And in that case, we might be looking at buildings that have 100 to maybe longer 100-year lifespan. But at the same time, we're only really going to be able to measure the operational efficiencies up until that kind of hard cutoff. It's not to say that it's game over. At that point, there's still an importance on that, but to avoid the worst of it from what we know at our best right now, the focus on being able to do something strong about embodied carbon sooner than later is very important. So that's getting to the idea of setting embodied and operational performance targets. Balancing operational savings with associated embodied penalties is kind of the idea of, if you go with the most efficient system that is using an extra 6 inches of concrete, that may not get you the benefit that you're actually looking for when it comes to thinking about many of the missions associated with reducing climate change and the overall carbon footprint of many of our businesses and institutions that we're starting to see written into policy now. The last element here is that the sooner you get moving on it, the easier it will be to address. You have to be able to take into consideration embodied carbon. Even if we got all of our buildings to zero footprint, which would be an amazing thing, there's still the aspect of that the world is still growing, we're still building new buildings, and those will have their associated footprints as well. So Lee, in his very gracious introduction, talked a little bit about our first mission at Interface, which was, we called it Mission Zero. And it was something, a course set forth in 1996 that by the year 2020, Interface would be a zero footprint business. It was my grandfather's audacious goal and dream. He didn't live long enough to see it fulfilled, but I'm pleased to say that in 2019, we were able to fully say on net, and admittedly, we still have room to grow and find other ways to make our systems more efficient from a climate standpoint, but on net with offsets at every bit of our business supply chain up and down at zero footprint. But it started leaving us the question as it was becoming clear that we might be able to pull that off, that what happens when you get to zero? It raises the question, and I've often compared it to the Hippocratic Oath of Medicine, the first line of which is first, do no harm. But it goes on a good bit further than that to talk about how you make someone better. It's about healing in that case. In this situation, we've taken our first step to meet that goal of, first, do no harm. But then what do you do from there? If we've compared Mission Zero to, summiting the highest peak of challenge that there might be around industrial sustainability, well, do you just go plant a flag and sit on top of the mountain and say, we're not jerks anymore? I don't know that that's as visionary once you're there as it sounded, back in the mid 90s. So for us, that new mission is called Climate Take Back, and it revolves around 4 principles. The first of which is Live Zero, and that's to continue to pursue all of the avenues that are important for us to make sure that we're not backsliding on any of the items that make it easy for us to offset those last bits to get us to where we need to for a zero footprint. The second, which is honestly to me the most compelling, is in a lot of ways a mindset change. For many of us who are familiar with, maybe too familiar with the impacts of climate change, it's very easy to view carbon as the negative, as a negative, but it's not an inherently evil material. It's really a misallocation of resources, and we're carbon-based life forms. We're using carbon for honestly, and some of it's some of the ways you can think of it of its lowest potential use to the biosphere. In this case, you can build life out of it. Why can't you build products? And that's really where we're starting to see some of our great innovations come from, is starting to think about carbon as a resource as opposed to carbon as a pollutant that simply must be avoided. Well, it's a lot easier to value a byproduct when you're thinking about it as a building block that you can make better materials from. So some really tremendous inspiration in the way that we're conceiving and designing our products coming from that as well. The third element is letting nature cool, allowing the natural pieces of the carbon cycle to continue to function in the way that they can. Many of those systems are certainly stressed and taxed right now. But if we're able to take, for lack of a better term, literally the heat off of Mother Nature, many of those systems can help us return to a more resilient state where that carbon balance is going in the right direction if you do it right. And then the fourth of these, which is in many ways the most ambitious, but one that we feel like we have some experience with as a business, kind of teaching the rest of the industrial business community about, is leading the industrial re-revolution. If the first industrial revolution was all about the extra energy that we could add to productivity by burning carbon, this would be the revolution that teaches us how to do it in the same way that our natural systems do, while creating less pollutants and more abundance for all of the stakeholders involved, and really charting a new course that allows for true sustainability and integration with our biosphere as opposed to something being separate from it. So that, in a nutshell, is our vision for climate take back. With that in mind, how do we reduce embodied carbon, not just as a business with interfaces, the microcosm that's there, but for those of you who've been well versed in how to address operational carbon in your structures, there are two primary paths. There's a prescriptive path and there's a performance path. And these are kind of the ways that you would have gone about it. The checklist approach, or kind of an energy modeling approach to a structure that you might either have on campus or something similar. And it's really not too dissimilar when it comes to the embodied carbon process for design and policy. The first and most potentially interesting for these is going to be the performance path. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth here. And then on the other side of it as well is more of the checklist approach when you're looking at evaluating materials. Hey, how did you source your energy for this? What system did you use to smelt that steel? Or how much recycled content is there actually in there? Therefore, avoiding all of the extraction and refinement process that has already gone into making that material once. And when you're looking at the performance path, the tool that I'm honestly far too excited about from just being a building nerd is what we call the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator. Some of you may be familiar with this one at buildingtransparency.org, but for those of you who aren't, this is a 100% free, all you do is sign up to use it, collection of all of the attached footprints of many of the major core and shell elements, several interiors finishes that are readily available, drawn from the publicly reported environmental product declaration materials that are there that say, hey, for this unit of material, there is this much CO2 released to make it. All of this is publicly available, but up until very recently hadn't been collected, calculated, and put into an easily accessible apples to apples side-by-side comparison, and tremendous tool that's opening up a lot of ways for us to make some of our most rapid and biggest steps in addressing embodied carbon in buildings. And what you're seeing is a little bit of kind of the breakdown of how that might go. It's really the brainchild of, believe it or not, Microsoft was asking the question of, they have a new headquarters under construction. They wanted to know what the footprint would be of those materials that went into it. And the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington said, well, let's check and see. And in the process, kind of looked and found these things that were kind of spread to the wind and brought them together. These are some of the founders that helped to make that happen. We were fortunate to be involved with that, as well as Skanska from the construction side of things. And the Sea Change Labs were the folks who really kind of designed and put it to work. What you're seeing, and we'll move very quickly through this since it is kind of a wonky, almost terrifying looking flow chart, but all you're basically getting is a breakdown of materials on the left-hand side, the different interior elements, whether it's finishes or construction, breaking down into the total interiors. And then you can look at the total project. From top to bottom represents the carbon footprint of all of the materials used as a baseline. And then anything with these negative arrows pointing down represents the target, the achieved target between the two of achievable materials, business as usual, best case scenario, and then seeing how far you can drive your carbon emissions within that scope, how far down you can bring it. So that's essentially what you're after, where all of those things get calculated into one place. And when we think about it from the prescriptive path, embodied carbon, thinking about, hey, if we do this, this, and this will help. It won't necessarily quantify it quite as cleanly, but can certainly point us in the right direction. There is the carbon smart materials palette. Now, from a commercial standpoint, some of these elements will certainly be very appropriate. And it really calls out what can be some of the highest impact materials for where you might use them. Concrete and steel, as I said, did you melt a rock to make this thing? Oftentimes will be your biggest components. And we'll see that in the project example we'll look at in a moment. But you may notice that wood winds up in both of these categories of both carbon smart and high impact. And it has everything to do with how that wood is sourced, how it's grown, how it's harvested, and what the impact might be. Something that brings, you harvested out of the Amazon rainforest, that might bring, several unidentified species to natures with it as it hits the ground. is going to have a much different carbon impact than something grown in our temperate forests that are properly managed and allow for, in this case, wood to act as a carbon sink. You know, many of you are starting to probably hear a bit about mass laminated timber structures and the fact that we can build mid-rise buildings out of those by simply being smarter about how we utilize wood, locking it up in a way that it won't encounter the atmosphere in a 100 to 200-year-old building, using a material that is rapidly renewable on a geologic scale. Some really exciting materials there. Some of these materials are perhaps more appropriate for the residential side, but you get the idea as well. These are the founding members of the Materials Carbon Action Network. This is the group that really created the industry support and drive to crafting the EC3 tool that you're seeing. Interface, Skanska, and Gensler were big parts of that as well. But within that as well, you've got Armstrong for ceiling and wall solutions, Certainteed insulations, and then US Gypsum for many of their gypsum and wall board products as well. All have carbon, low carbon, no carbon, or in some cases, negative carbon materials that you can utilize on your project that are then factored in to the EC3 calculator. As I was mentioning, a lot of this sounds all well and good, but until you put it into practice, you don't really know what you can work with and what kind of benefits that you can realize. This particular project is really shooting for a net zero carbon. That was what they were aiming for. This is the international terminal that I believe is still under construction at San Francisco International Airport. I'm sure they've had more time to work on that unencumbered this year. But what you'll see is that the baseline established for what they would anticipate this project releasing would be essentially 593 pounds of CO2 per square foot with a 50-year operating time frame. We'll give them credit for that they're not doing the 29 years, but you know, so it is, setting a not too far off in the distant future operational consideration. And they also set the 124 for the operational. What they found was that in applying many of the principles of the Materials Smart Palette and the EC3 tool, is they were able to reduce the overall footprint of this building 79%. Sure, they took some elements of that would have been more expensive to make it work, but in a project that was really shooting for what's really possible, it's important to note that 79, 80% is absolutely within reach of these considerations, using no high-tech space age materials, just more thoughtfully sourced steel, better designed concrete that has more opportunity to avoid burning all the lime to essentially create the cement that goes into it. And you can see it here that really your biggest opportunities in any of your projects you might encounter are really focusing on your steel and your concrete reductions. What you're getting as you get into the smaller elements of the total composition kind of takes you there. And what you ended up seeing was all of the different pieces that go into it. I'm happy to say that carpet tile here still was able to cut that in half. So this was something that Gensler worked closely with them to kind of generate and go from there. But it's important to remember that that's not just going to be on your 100, 200, $300 million plus projects where you can have real impact. This is actually kind of a visual representation of a case study done by the Gensler office as well, that kind of took the lead on approaching the interiors packages, some of the things that you might be looking at right now in your personal space. And essentially this represents the carbon footprint of a 20,000 square foot tenant fit out. Real estate transaction, somebody has to get a new space for their new office, and these are all of the elements that would typically go into them. So for a baseline, they picked a project before there was any way to really effectively calculate the carbon footprint of that relatively small, maybe a couple $1 million worth of work that was done, and pulled it off the shelf and said, well, okay, that's what we did. Here's where it stacks up using this EC3 tool calculator. On the other side of it, and while controlling for price, for aesthetic, and performance, the main three elements you're considering when you're finishing out a space, controlling for those, and then only adding in, hey, what if we knew and prioritized a lower carbon footprint, making sure that it performed the same, cost the same, and looked comparable, the results were pretty remarkable. And essentially no other sacrifice, just being able to measure it, you were able to reduce the footprint of that project 43% with regards to embodied carbon. And that's a no sacrifice situation. To me, that's really, really exciting because this is so early in the ability for us to measure it that the biggest, fastest strides that we can take that need to happen closer to now than another 20 years down the road can be happening because so much of this technology exists about low carbon materials that have been thoughtful about how they source and refine and manage their materials gets us to a place where essentially, if you have an administration that isn't particularly interested in this, say, well, it costs the same, and then say, oh, by the way, you can go and tell your students you just saved 43% on your interiors package. And you can take credit for that, even if it's not an interest to them. It's kind of almost this covert sustainability that can take place with that, which I think is really kind of fun. And I know many of you are probably well versed in achieving that kind of goal as well. This is a little bit of a peek behind the curtain for what you could anticipate the information in that EC3 tool to spit out for you. This is actually taking an 18-ounce standard carpet tile with all of the different backing and nylon combinations that you could get throughout the industry. This is once again pulling from the EPDs released with each of these product combinations. And what you're seeing is essentially there's a huge delta, what you would call comparable products from a performance or price point standing, that when doing an apples to apples comparison, you can have something with an embodied carbon footprint of less than 3 kilograms before any kind of offsets, and compare that side by side potentially in a bid package of something that's well over 20, a delta of 10 in that case. And what I would recommend is that you're not going to run into any conflicts if you simply drew a line down the middle of this graph and said, we're not playing on the right-hand side of this. 50%, you have to be in the lower 50% to consider using your product, whether it's on our campus or in our company or that kind of thing. When that kind of information is available, the first thing that a rep like me from one of these competitor companies might be saying, if they find out from you that, I'm sorry, you're no longer in consideration, you don't offer a product with a low enough embodied carbon footprint, that person is on the phone before they're back to their car or before they're even hung up on your Zoom call that they're having that conversation to their manager saying, I just lost a job or an account to something I'd never heard before called embodied carbon. And that's the level of influence that many professionals in your position can have, is the second that they hear that's the case, I promise you that in this time, a year from now, this graph is already coming down on the right-hand side. And I can promise you that because it happened already. This is the second, third iteration of this graph where many of the worst offenders hearing about it, seeing it, running into it, or being informed of it with some of their clients have made drastic changes. And that's the level of influence that you potentially have by saying, this is how we're going to choose to spend our dollars. Peeking behind the curtain a little bit towards what we've done at Interface more is not so much to brag on us, but to kind of point out what a dirty industry like the carpet industry, the flooring industry can potentially get to, and the doors it opens up for many others, is essentially looking at our first iteration of a 12-ounce carpet tile, which for us, we've done the testing to show that it's perfectly commercially viable by adding the level of density with a tight weave of the face fiber. But what you're seeing right here on the left-hand side of the graph is actually our first combination of materials with face fiber and backing that allow us to go to a carbon negative material. It breaks the cycle of tying consumption to carbon emissions. Essentially, you buy more of this particular formulation from Interface or any other manufacturer that breaks this barrier, and your building is no longer contributing to climate change. Your building, or at least that part of the trade, is offering a solution. You buy more stuff, less carbon in the atmosphere. That to me feels like a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. It felt that way when we set out on this journey as well. But to me, it's really a fascinating approach that shows that we're starting to get a little bit closer to those systems that provide abundance in nature to multitudes of organisms, while at every exchange pulling down carbon and creating a less toxic atmosphere for our species and the biosphere as a whole. So really, really neat stuff there. As I said, all that we make, everything that we offer as a product is a zero carbon footprint, but we're starting to get to the point where we can offer carbon negative products. We launched that first one in 2020, kind of being the real inflection point between Mission Zero and Climate Take Back. And for us, it represents a really exciting new time. I'm happy to say that last slide is actually slightly out of date, in that we've found one of our suppliers has come up with a new formulation with an even higher recycled content and lower carbon footprint associated with the nylon. So the more recycled content in the nylon, the lower the footprint there, the more we can use in getting it into that 18 to 20 ounce, more standard carpet tile construction that's there. So it's very reasonable from an affordable standpoint to use these materials on whatever your next project might be, to say that's a carbon negative floor. A little breakdown on how that actually works. The tufting of a carpet tile, what we call the pre-coat, and then the 2 layers of backing with kind of the backbone that gives it its shape. You don't want carpet tile changing, but essentially we have a little bit of a carbon footprint associated with the face fiber still. But by using a really high concentration of bioresins, essentially plastics that don't go through the, hey, let's go rot in the ground for a few thousand millennia to turn into an oil-based product. We're sourcing that from things that are rapidly renewable when in the form of resins and concentrated carbon fillers that can come from non-agricultural plant waste products, essentially making our materials out of plants much more effectively than we had been able to do even 5 years before. And that gives us the opportunity to, once again, capture more carbon, store it in a place that it's not going to become an atmospheric challenge, and lock it up in a place that's infinitely recyclable, as our system has been designed to do for 20 plus years. And not just to talk about it, this is an example of one of those carbon negative products. We call it Zen Stitch. It was launched in our Embodied beauty collection about 5 months ago. And, it's one thing to say, hey, you need to make the sacrifice from an aesthetic standpoint to put this on your floor because it's the right thing to do. It's quite another to make it a beautiful product that's perfectly usable, that people will say, that's really slick. And oh, by the way, you're helping address climate change with this product by pulling down and storing the CO2 in the backing of the product. For those of you in public institutions, if you don't spec it, you won't get it. There is nothing proprietary about the carbon footprint of a material. You can design around those. You can use those EPDs in the same way that we have, or setting limits or brackets on prioritizing materials that use low carbon footprints really effectively. LEED is offering pilot credits for those as well, for projects that you may be pursuing that have LEED certification. Know that with all of these that are the main materials that are typically tied to the EC3 and oftentimes the biggest movers of carbon, what you're seeing here on the left-hand side with the materials scope, you can receive a few pilot credits, 1 or 2, depending on how much you end up using of those materials. And for a little more information to kind of pursue where you might be able to find this, the New Carbon Architecture by Bruce King is a great resource. Digging further into the Materials Carbon Action Network, these are going to be suppliers who are going to have solutions for much of what you really want to find if you're prioritizing low carbon materials where you can, to address kind of that big chunk of carbon that's released in the process of manufacturing the elements and components and materials of a building. These people will have solutions for you there. And I kind of like to end on the idea of bringing this once again back to people. And I love this quote from Desmond Tutu, and that people of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. And I'd like to leave you with kind of this thought, that as a consumer, I'd like to believe that most of us try and do our very best to make good choices that don't harm others indirectly or directly through how we spend our earnings. But what I will say for those of you who are in a position to either specify or influence how a building project proceeds, if you think about voting with your dollars, maybe someone can anticipate earning somewhere between maybe $3 million in their entire working career. If you think of that as the 2 to 3 million votes for good materials, average materials, or bad materials, that's a really important part of a way you can influence things from an economic standpoint. But if you're in the process involved with designing and building projects, I've never encountered a capital project that's $2 or $3 million that, the opportunities for a building, if we're talking about voting with our dollars of 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 million dollar projects are reasonable. And the level of impact you can have with those decisions through your work, I think could outweigh any of the decisions you choose to make with what you do at home in a fell swoop. So there's so much opportunity for the specifiers and decision makers around buildings to wear the superhero cape when it comes to climate change and address this low-hanging fruit that's right there, so readily accessible through new measurement tools, to put you in a position where you can say, I've offset more carbon than anyone could have imagined because of the decisions I was able to make with my building projects. And I think that's kind of a strange way to look at it, but I really love what that means for there being a smaller group of people being able to have such an outsized impact. So that's really what I've got for y'all today. I hope that was informative, and love to move it over to the questions portion of this as well. Lee, do I need to stop sharing this to go ahead?
Stop sharing.
Perfect.
Jay, that was great. Thank you. It's such an eloquent delivery, and your passion rings through, and just really appreciate all of your experience. I was, thinking about, just your grandfather must be so proud of you, from wherever he is. And, and I think that it's fascinating to me that what he learned, I guess, almost 25 years ago, where, he was asked a question about interfaces, environmental impact, by potential customers, and and now you're asking us to ask our sales reps about embodied carbon, and it just is such a really cool full circle.
Yeah, virtuous cycle for sure.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the Climate Take Back is such a generous new mission for Interface. I have a feeling this was inspired by your factory as a forest design inspirations, and I was wondering if you could expand on that just a little more.
Yeah, so Factories as Forests has been a really, really fascinating exploration of kind of integrating systems in a way that's certainly more considerate and more friendly to it. But in a nutshell, our Factories as Forests programs, any of the structures that we have, and we say factories because it just rolls off the tongue easier, but whether it's our office buildings, our headquarters in Atlanta, what we end up doing in that program is essentially doing a biological and ecological assessment of the services provided of that patch of land where our structure will exist, and thinking about what would the building do, what would that land do, excuse me, if the building were not there, and then holding ourselves to the standard of saying, well, if that were a forest, it would provide energy in the form of solar energy, and the acorns it would provide to the deciduous forest, to the critters that would be running around feeding the ecosystem there. So we have to be able to capture that much energy with the site itself. It would be filtering water, and it would be providing habitat. And those are all of the elements that we want to make sure that not only from a visual standpoint does it fit in beautifully with the surroundings, but it actually provides a similar level of service, and maybe more someday if we can ever achieve that, than had we not built it at all. We want to make sure that that is not something that costs stakeholders in the form of the creatures and biosphere or ecosystems around us, that they wouldn't be negatively impacted by us creating something that can generate value for our employees and customers as well.
So we have a lot of questions. We're going to just jump into it. And one of them that just came in, are there steel and concrete solutions for carbon negative construction? I know there are concrete applications that I've heard of. What do you know?
Yeah, so we're seeing really rapid progress in that category. The best thing to look for when you're addressing steel, because there will always still be a degree of energy usage of even recycling steel. But if you can avoid the materials extraction, for every percentage point of recycled material, that's that percentage of your structure that's not having to come out of all of the energy that goes into initially extracting, refining, and smelting that material. And the energy to reframe, reforge steel is substantially less when it's got higher recycled content. There's really cool applications, and I think concrete is moving even at a faster clip as far as that's concerned, of actually being able to store bubbles of CO2 inside the structure itself, because it's really the cementitious portion of it. The filler is not so much carbon challenging, if you will. It's the cooking lime to make it sticky enough to hold all of the aggregate together that's really the trick. But in that kind of liquid state, there's really cool opportunities to bubble it through in either precast solutions or pour in place formulations of it as well. But once again, it's really coming down to the fact that we've only recently been able to actually measure it and consistently. And the moment that somebody sets a standard of saying, hey, pursue this, it'll be kind of like what we saw, I hope, with LEED, where the idea of many of the initial goals are just building standards now that were set forth, that as you can measure it, you can start to move it, is what I'm hoping to see there for sure.
Are you seeing where decisions around steel and concrete applications for structural loads are changing to reduce unnecessary material?
Yeah, that is the slower moving piece of this, where code that might be built around, material standards from decades ago that maybe haven't been reconsidered or taken into account. I touched on, for example, mass laminated timber, and most building codes limit any stick built structure to 4 stories because it's still got this concept of, milled pine 2x4s nailed together, and like, well, it's probably not a good idea to go much higher than that. But when you're talking about super plywood, for lack of a better term, tens of stories are certainly possible with carbon sequestering materials in that case. To get it back to the building standards, that is tricky, and that's where the AIA and the engineering trade groups really, we need representation at the table for them to know that, hey, we want to make sure that as material science changes, you all are up to date on making sure that these structures still retain their safety and allow people to feel confident in using them as well.
But speaking of material science development, how is the cross-laminated timber market developing in the Southeast? I know it's strong in the Northwest, but what are you seeing here and kind of on this side of the Mississippi?
I'm certainly not an expert in the industry itself. I don't want to go too far in over my skis here, but what I will say is that a lot of our forestry products in this part of the world are seeing actually strong competition, strangely, for the pellet energy market, where the way things were considered in Europe in terms of writing a lot of their climate legislation is that if you burn wood for your energy, then it's a net zero. And while that could technically be true, they're not factoring in the fact that the timber and pelletization takes energy and then gets on a boat and sails across an ocean and then goes through that route. And I would much rather see a lot of our really rapidly renewable forestry products industry in the Southeast specifically being moved towards things where we're harvesting timber, laminating it together, and making sure that it's a resilient product that isn't going anywhere close to burning anytime soon, and locking it up in our structures. So I can't say where it's headed, but I know that there is certainly competition from kind of a backwards incentive for the way the laws are written in the European Union for sourcing carbon smart fuel sources.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how much material from Eastern North Carolina and the Southeast does go to Europe for the pellet industry.
Yep. Yep.
Another material question: what's the potential for hempcrete as a building material, and why hasn't it taken off yet? And is there are there opportunities around this technology?
There probably are. I am officially getting in over my expertise when it comes to certain elements of the concrete and steel industry. You're getting, little bits of the information that I get to see from grant proposals and different foundations for solutions around these kinds of things. Um, my guess with the hemp side of it is mainly around the challenges that have always been around the hemp industry and its adjacency to the cannabis side of things that have always kind of presented challenges. But any kind of filler that strengthens concrete is going to go a long way. One of the proposals that we saw was actually from the University of Pittsburgh recently for one of our grants that we chose not to fund because it looked like it was basically going to happen regardless, was actually for the use of carbon nanotubules to essentially lighten the weight of concrete and strengthen it. Almost 50%, I want to say, is what I recall, just by kind of weaving it in the same way that kind of an extra structure woven in through the concrete can add more strength in a organic material to lock it up, make it work better, and then once again use less of it is a really big part of it as well. The less concrete you can use, the less footprint there's going to be.
I heard another question that came in, thinking about, embodied carbon and how you explained it in your presentation. It says, this is a very forward-thinking approach, i.e. choosing the path forward. I'm curious if you find any value in looking retrospectively into the embodied carbon of existing buildings, as it may be difficult to do anything about spent carbon other than offsetting.
Yeah, so what that really gets to is that the least carbon footprint project you're going to encounter is a reuse. That's really, if I'm gathering from that question and observation, is that if you can repurpose a structure effectively, that's going to avoid many of the biggest elements of the core and shell that, as we saw from the San Francisco terminal, where so much of the impact is. If you're essentially reducing it to some interior construction and materials, fit out, even if it's drastically changing the structure, you're not encountering the removal of material to put something back in its place and essentially throwing out the, for lack of a better term, perfectly functionally effective materials that are there just to essentially change the aesthetic. So the retrospective consideration is, I don't think it's unfair at all to give yourself credit for saying we could have built a new building here. We had the funding for it, but we chose to renovate in what someone might look at and say, oh, that's a crazy way to go about it. That'd be more expensive potentially to renovate that space. But that's once again, not considering the carbon budget of a project as well. And if, you choose to assign a carbon value to a dollar value to your carbon emissions associated with any of your activities, whether it's on a campus or in an organization, that math starts to change really quickly as far as how you'd think about it there.
Yeah. So, I know it's difficult to predict the future, but what are your thoughts about future carbon taxes or fees that might target that 90% that you referenced, within the embodied carbon space?
Yeah, I saw it today. One of the more exciting things that's kind of happened is, the administrations change like the winds, it feels like in some cases. But one of the things that's coming out of, for example, the GSA and federal purchasing contracts that kind of gives air cover to colleges and universities to say, here's how we're doing it. They're prioritizing lower carbon materials as well. And with their however billion, right, maybe it's not that many square feet of space, they're able to throw their weight around pretty substantially. And it's kind of like what you saw with emissions standards with vehicles, that you might have it established in one administration and then the rules are changed, but business responding to those is always going to go with the low because they don't ever want to find themselves on the wrong side of it based on how an election swung. So if the standards are set, it generally is one of the places where government influence can help to drive things and keep things lower, even if there's going to be an every 4-year oscillation in terms of executive order for priorities and that kind of thing as well. So I'm generally optimistic. That document for the GSA actually was published in late February. We're talking 3 weeks ago for prioritizing that. We're excited at Interface for, perhaps expanded opportunity to sell to the federal government there as well. But when those standards start getting adopted and when you're considering the major clients that are out there, the positive influence is that, if you build it to the best standards, like many businesses build their products to the standards set in California and then just sell that standard everywhere else. When the largest, most demanding customers tend to overlap, it moves things in the right direction.
So you mentioned, how we can influence our suppliers by asking them questions about embodied carbon, profile of their products. How else can, like campus building professionals specifically, or within industry, how do we help them get started? Do we, send them to building transparency and get them familiar with the EC3 tool? Is that just a really great place to start to kind of start to build their literacy around this?
I think it would be if you've got the relationship there that there's one of trust built between your sides, because oftentimes sustainability office and building a construction are lumped together, but not always seeing things from the same side of the table. If there's a great degree of trust there, that's a great place to start people. The other place that I think there's great opportunity if you're an administrative level and are able to influence it from a downstream standpoint is making sure that you're asking your architect and design professionals to incorporate that as their standards as well. As we're looking at the graph, I don't think it's unreasonable to start saying that we would prefer to play in the lower half or lower third of available materials. Now that you can measure it and you say, hey, here's the bracket and pricing that we're willing to stand with, within the 4 or 5 suppliers of material X, somebody is going to have a lower carbon footprint than the other. And I think if you're able to say tie goes to the low carbon footprint, or even if it's a 5% difference, we place an X dollar value associated with a ton of CO2, then you can say, well, if you're factoring that in it as well, then especially with the priorities set forth with many universities having signed on to all sorts of levels of commitment, there's going to be ways to justify it for sure. And oftentimes the statements at the highest level don't always come down to the level of direct implementation, but I think connecting those dots is absolutely one of the most important ways to make it happen.
Do you know if there are any other resources that are that kind of support purchasing within large institutions that where we can look at embodied carbon profiles of products that aren't necessarily building materials?
I don't necessarily have that level of breadth in terms of lower materials that are there. Gosh, I've seen folks with efforts for outdoor gear, but I think it's kind of a disparate. I'd love to see almost a nutrition label that's just standard on materials that says, here's your carbon footprint for buying this. And if it's 2 pennies more to buy the organic one in terms of food, yeah, sure, do that. And if it's 3 pennies more to get the lower carbon footprint, I think a lot of people would be willing to do that as well. But I don't. I wish I did. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. We'll keep looking for that. So one final question. How can recent graduates help further efforts like this so we can accelerate towards lower carbon budget / emissions sooner than later? I feel that newer generations care more on average than older generations, but newer generations may not have the experience necessary to influence things right out of school.
Yeah, I'd say, the strange part about that is fast as things are moving on this, the experience excuse that you're often hearing at higher level representation tends to create a lot of, I'm not going to say echo chambers as far as that goes, but when the folks who are learning the newest material, i.e. recent graduates, I think there's more opportunity when there's more of you to say these are things that we choose to see within our workplace, within our institution where we are. I think you're actually seeing a lot of that with the confluence of equity and inclusivity and social justice movements as well, being driven by youth and younger people, more recent graduates within their organizations. And there's no reason that that can't work from a carbon standpoint as well. In fact, I see those things very closely tied together because it ultimately becomes an issue of inclusivity and social justice, because we're mainly motivated for doing something about climate change because of its influence on people. We tried that it's bad for the planet, and nobody's met a person named the planet yet. And we relate to people, and that's where I think that can potentially change. I don't know if that feels like a cop out answer other than like storming the boardroom with signs, but I generally find that if you can ask good questions when you do have those quick interactions with higher ups in a respectful way and say, hey, we just want to make sure you're considering what's next, because we are what's next and we've got perspective to offer. That, whether it's a business or an institution, you don't want to be on the wrong side of a growing social movement that starts asking hard questions that you've not considered.
Yeah, I've really seen an increase in that case where we're, thinking about people as strongly as we're thinking about our places. So, Jay, you're someone that thinks very deeply about people and places. We really appreciate the time you've spent with us today, all the work you're doing, on behalf of people and places all around the world. The Interface story is incredible, and your family's legacy is just a gift to us all. So just thank you so much. And it's just great to have you. Look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, absolutely, Lee. My pleasure today. And thank you for the kind words. And I sincerely hope to those who are able to listen in today that it was helpful, informative, maybe even a little entertaining, and something that, will give you some starting places or, at least a little bit more motivation to go make it better. So thank you.
All right.
Till
So
then.
that wraps up our spring webinar series. I want to thank all of you that participated either through a presentation or an attendee. Remember, these have been recorded, and you can go to sustain.appstate.edu to find a link to our YouTube channel that hosts the recordings. So we'll have more content through the Appalachian Energy Summit in the future, and we look forward to sharing with you, and have a great rest of your day.
Cheers. Thanks, Lee.